They were in service for more than 30 years. Type 206 submarines and the upgraded 206 Alpha version. In the early 1970s, the German Navy at the time took delivery of its new weapon during the Cold War. The mission? Reconnaissance, surveillance, and sealing off the Baltic Sea in case the NATO alliance had to be invoked. The last 6 Type 206 Alpha boats were decommissioned in 2010. Most of them have long since been scrapped. But in 2023, one of them is going on one final big voyage. U17, call number S196, is set to survive. The boat will become part of the collection of the Technikmuseum Speyer. Its final journey of around 1,200 kilometers will take it deep into Germany, over canals and rivers, and finally over land. A heavy transport on the edge of feasibility, and a colossal spectacle. Kiel, April 2023. U17 is still afloat, but the days of diving and full speed ahead are long gone. The vessel needs the help of a tugboat to navigate the Kiel fjord. Type 206 is small as far as military submarines go. For a heavy transport, though, the dimensions are enormous. With a length of almost 50 meters, the U17 is 9 meters high, 4.6 meters wide, and weighs in at 500 metric tons. Retired Captain Junior Grade Jürgen Weber completed his commander's course aboard the vessel 39 years ago. The managing director of the German Submariners Association is very keen to preserve the 206 class.
The best way to remember the boats of the 206 Alpha class these days is with the number 5. The boat has a draft of almost 5 meters, it's almost 50 meters long, weighs almost 500 tons, and is currently almost 50 years old.
U17 entered service with the German Navy in November 1973. Unlike other submarines of the Cold War era, it sailed not only the North and Baltic Seas, but the Mediterranean as well. And in 1997, it became the first post-war German submarine to cross the Atlantic.
The U17 was the first German submarine since the merchant submarine U Deutschland, the first German submarine to enter Baltimore Harbor in 1916. U26 and U17 were the first 2 boats to sail by way of the Azores towards the American East Coast. This was after the actions, after the hostilities of the Second World War. These were the first German submarines to cross over there.
Project manager Martin Hess is in charge of shore leave for the decommissioned submarine.
It's hard to approach like this. He has to use the tugboat. He should have used 2, plain and simple. They enter the base and stern first, but they should actually go in with the bow because they're going to slide the boat under our straps, which are up there on the crane. Problem is the rudder hook in the back. It'd get caught up in the straps.
The straps are the lifting gear with which a gantry crane will hoist the 500-ton boat out of the water.
We don't lift a boat out of the water every day, but we also lift large sections when we build ships. They weigh 400 to 600 tons. But a submarine like this is a different thing. It's something really exciting.
Exciting for Jürgen Gadick, too. He spent 10 years at sea as an STO, that is, Marine Engineer Officer aboard the U17.
It's an uplifting moment to see the boat in motion again and to know that afterwards the boat will be in the museum and accessible to everyone.
When the U17 crossed the Atlantic in 1997, retired Captain Michael Setzer was head of the 3rd Submarine Squadron.
This makes it possible not only to preserve the cutting-edge technology of the time and share it with the public, but also to look back on the importance of submarines and the people in them and the security policy back then.
But first, the boat has to be brought ashore, and everyone lends a hand.
It's a point of honor, really, to make sure the boat comes to rest properly. Good seamanship means everyone pitches in.
With the U17 hanging on a hook and lifted out of the water, its full dimensions become apparent. A picture made for submariners.
All in all, I was very impressed with the transport from Kiel to Speyer. For example, it was no everyday occurrence for me to see a 500-ton submarine hanging from the 900-ton gantry crane at ThyssenKrupp Marine Systems. I couldn't get enough of pictures like that. An eel. Now we know what's for lunch.
There's always a stowaway, right?
Commissioned in 1973, the U-17's last deployment was to the Mediterranean in 2010. It was then decommissioned after 37 years. Jürgen Giedicke spent 10 of his 21 years of submarine service aboard the U-17 and took part in the Atlantic cruise too, 19 days underwater at depths of up to 100 meters.
Only artificial light, 19 days long. You knew what time of day it was based on the meals on board.
Sealed off and crammed into a steel tube stuffed with technology underwater. What most might find frightening has always been the norm for submariners.
There isn't much space. It's the warm bunk principle, which means that one person is on watch and the other sleeps in the bunk. And at the change of watch, you trade places. Everyone has their own sleeping bag, but essentially they're climbing into the warm bunk of their predecessor.
As you can imagine, the diesel exhaust, human exhaust, and vapors, the cooking smells, all go to create a really nice mix of odors. And we didn't call it submarine stench. We called it Anti-Chanel No. 5.
Jürgen Giedicke was responsible for the safe operation of the technology on board. One toilet for 22 men, with phases of work and rest alternating every 6 hours, and limited leisure opportunities.
Table tennis was difficult. You can bring a book to read. We had a DVD player on board to watch movies, and we played cards. Otherwise, you try to catch up on the sleep you might have missed.
And yet this time was one of the best of his naval career. This is mainly a result of the camaraderie. Submarining is not everyone's cup of tea.
As part of the crew, you have to have self-restraint. You can't just be the alpha dog all the time. There's really only one of those aboard, and that's the one wearing the white cap, the commander.
The 62-year-old is still in contact with many of his comrades today, and the original tower crest as the last ahoy is his pride and joy.
The 3 dolphins symbolize agility, cunning, and speed.
For the U-17, the first stop on the way to the museum is a dry dock in Kiel. Here, it's thoroughly cleaned and, above all, made unserviceable.
Now it's here, first of all, to be demilitarized. This means they make sure that the vehicle can no longer be used for military purposes.
As a museum exhibit, the U-17 has no further need for military technology. Nevertheless, it should still convey a realistic impression.
Demilitarization was my biggest concern with this project. I worked very hard on it because submarines U9 and U10, which are in German museums, were simply senselessly destroyed, particularly in terms of their marine engineering. And with the U-17, we wanted to avoid that. We had very constructive consultations with all of the stakeholders at the right time. So we managed to make sure that the minimum requirements would be met. This includes damaging the diving cells, that is, cutting a hole in them, so they can't be blown out anymore, so water can't be blown out anymore, leaving air inside to make the boat buoyant.
The boat's static structure is also modified to make sure it can never go to sea again.
For stability reasons, 2 trusses, the ribs of the boat, so to speak, were cut. That was also done in a way that no one on board will notice. And the propulsion system is demilitarized the moment when we take the 130-ton propulsion battery off board in Speyer. And the last important thing was that the weapon control system was removed from the ship so that we couldn't fire torpedoes. We wouldn't be able to do that on dry land anyway, but it just made things a little safer.
Even after demilitarization, the boat will be presented to museum visitors in the condition in which it was in use for many years. A painstaking restoration backed by a great deal of expertise.
It was very, very well done by the people involved from the shipyard in Kiel. This cut of the trusses, disassembling the diving cells and the inner workings of our weapon console, that's something nobody can see from the outside. So the boat looks almost the way it did when it was still in active service, and we're very happy about that.
Back in the day, Type 206A was a weapon that had to be taken seriously.
The Class 206 Alpha also had 8 torpedo tubes on the bow, and battle cargo always consisted of 7 torpedoes on board in the torpedo tubes. There was no reloading capacity, and 1 torpedo tube was always left free for frogman missions. I had that myself, even as a commander. I was delighted whenever the frogman returned to the torpedo tube. And one time I heard a crash just forward in the watchroom, that something had tipped over. I went there and asked what was going on, and the people were just laughing. And I didn't feel comfortable with that situation at all. And then someone pointed to one of the frogman's fins, which was cut off in a semicircle at the tip. It had been sliced away by the muzzle of the torpedo tube flap, and you could easily have lopped off a few toes with it. So when the frogman saw this fighting machine, he keeled over and fainted.
Insertion and removal through a submarine's torpedo tube makes it possible to transport frogmen covertly to their deployment location. They report to the Naval Special Forces Command and, like the 1st Submarine Squadron, are stationed in Eckernförde. The frogmen are trained for a wide variety of missions. They specialize in covert commando operations in coastal areas, for reconnaissance, but also for targeted attacks on operational or strategic targets. The frogmen are deployed whenever an object needs to be approached unseen. They operate in secret. Their identities are as secret as their missions. Even when they're dropped off by submarines, they often have to swim long distances in the open sea, sometimes for hours. All this with combat equipment weighing around 30 kilos. A battle against currents, waves, and the cold. Macerated, chafed skin is part of everyday life for these special forces. Their missions include defusing mines and planting explosive devices of their own. The elite soldiers were also deployed in the Horn of Africa against pirates trying to hijack merchant ships and kidnap their crews. Besides submarines, speedboats, and helicopters, the Special Forces also get around by kayak. To avoid attracting attention, they sink the kayaks at their destination. Later, after the mission, they use compressed air to bring the boats back to the surface. The frogmen cover the last stage underwater. One deployment scenario that is repeatedly practiced is to board a ship unnoticed. To stop pirates, for instance, or end a hostage situation. Such direct operations are narrowly defined in terms of time and space, and can also be used offensively to target objects, facilities, or individuals. They're silent and invisible until the end. Because the element of surprise is an important weapon. Transporting them to the deployment site in a submarine is designed to ensure this element of surprise. Eight torpedo tubes are the main weapon of the U-17. Unarmed torpedoes are typically used in training and practice.
My relationship with U-17 is also not an everyday one, because I did my commander's course on U-17 in 1984 and also fired my first practice torpedo and hit the target, meaning sending the torpedo under the target. We didn't shoot down our own ships. And then I was deployed again. That must have been in 1988, as commander for 10 to 14 days. So I also had command time on the U-17. That's really something I'm proud of.
In 1979, the German Navy practiced with an armed torpedo. The U-29, also a 206 class vessel, fired at Z1, a decommissioned destroyer off the coast of Crete.
We heard a huge bang under the water. And as we know from films, this bursting and this crunching, all these things we really experienced live. And we realized, because we'd heard very clearly that a ship had suddenly sunk, there was all this noise. It was strange and interesting at the same time. Nobody would have survived the detonation. We could measure that. The waves of pressure that would have coursed through the ship would have ejected the crew, and their limbs would not have remained on their bodies.
The Fletcher-class destroyers, taken over by the Americans, are a relic from the Second World War. Z1 was in service with the Navy as the USS Anthony until 1946. The torpedo broke the ship's spine.
The magnetic detonator detonates the torpedo 3 to 4 meters below the ship, beneath the ship. This creates a bubble that lifts the ship up at this point, usually midship, because the ship has the largest pressure point or magnetic point in the center, so it's lifted in the middle. It then practically bends, lifts up, falls back into this bubble, and then breaks through again. It's like a thin sheet of metal that you bend back and forth a few times until it snaps. In this case, it's only once. The ship breaks in the middle and sinks, no chance of survival at all.
Meanwhile, everything that made the U-17 a weapon has been removed. In the company of his former fellow crewmen, Jürgen Giedig bids farewell to his boat.
The close-knit atmosphere on board brings you so close together that you keep some of these friendships. So you're always happy to meet up again after your time at sea.
Entering the boat one last time is not permitted. Nobody else is allowed in, not even old sea dogs. This is because the U-17 hasn't yet been secured for transport on the floating pontoon.
The whole thing is considered to be cargo, and theoretically, since the boat isn't properly lashed in place yet, it could tip over. At least mathematically speaking. It's not an option at the moment. Plus, the boat is 9 meters tall, so you'd have to climb up ladders to get into the boat. That's too dangerous in its current state.
U-17 comes to rest on a specially manufactured steel formwork. Once secured in place, these steel holders are welded to the pontoon and the boat to secure it.
This is a sea crossing. There are hazards if it slips, of course. It can even capsize. So there will be lots of welding work, that is, lashing work, so that the insurance company can give the go-ahead for the pontoon to be towed across the North Sea.
The deep-sea tug that will tow the convoy is captained by Jan Frankena. Although the U17 is his first submarine in his 28 years as a captain, the Dutchman is relaxed about the upcoming trip across the high seas.
No, it's not difficult. Just use your head and think about it. When you have more experience, you understand how to do it. We do it all together. I have a really great crew on board. I'm very proud of that. And of course, of the tugboat itself.
The tug has 2,000 horsepower and is specially built for heavy transport on the high seas. Before it reaches the open sea, however, it will have to pass through the bottleneck of the Kiel Canal. Jan Frankena calculates that it will take around 12 hours to cross the 100-kilometer-long artificial waterway. The route continues across the North Sea past the East and West Frisian Islands and the Dutch coast to Rotterdam. From there, inland waterway pilots will take charge of the pontoon carrying the U17. The cost of the transport is around 2 million euros, collected from admission fees at the Technikmuseum and donations. The planning has been ongoing for 6 years, and as things finally get underway, the excitement is building.
We know what we're doing, we've calculated everything. We're not nervous, we're looking forward to it.
The next morning, U17 sets sail for the last time. Moored to the 66-meter-long pontoon, the submarine glides across the Kiel fjord. The deep-sea tug leads the way as another ship pushes from behind. This lends added stability to the roughly 120-meter tug group for its journey through the Kiel Canal. Jürgen Gedig waits at the Kiel-Holtenau lock for a last look at his submarine.
Sublime feeling. It's nice to see the boat pass by here on its way to the museum. Beautiful to behold.
The team travels through the Kiel Canal at just under 10 knots. A few fans are waiting on the banks. It's already clear that U17 will win many hearts on its final journey. But before that, it faces a new adventure, being towed through the open sea. And thanks to a tailwind, this happens surprisingly quickly. The tug group reaches the harbor in Dordrecht near Rotterdam in just 3 days instead of 4, much to the delight of the museum spokesman Holger Baschleben.
We get to see Van der Wees up close. We're delighted, and it's a nice way to finish the first stage.
Christine Illner has not yet seen U17 in the flesh. She's been busy these past few days feeding the museum's social media channels with posts about the unusual transport.
It is so wonderful that she's not being scrapped and is going to find a final harbor instead, so others who haven't gone to sea can have an opportunity to see a piece of history. And so it'll be preserved and kept alive here where people can continue to tour her.
U17 finally appears in the distance. The submarine approaches the shipyard at 6 knots. The tug group has covered 328 nautical miles thus far. The boat will never sail on its own again. When it was still active, it reached a maximum speed of 10 knots above water and 18 knots beneath the waves. There were a total of 12 subs in the 206 Alpha class.
The Type 206 is historically interesting because it was the backbone of German security and defense during the Cold War. And then after reunification, when things calmed down, it was also used in other maritime areas. Although it was actually only designed and intended for use in the North Sea and the Baltic Sea.
The submarine's main task? Reconnaissance, listening to what was happening. And for that mission, the 206 and 206 Alpha classes were perfectly equipped.
A sonar operator, Sony for short, sits here at the consoles. He listens and uses the system to determine vessel locations where the noises are. To his right is a sonar master who classifies these sounds. In other words, he can tell what kind of a vessel it is based on what is known as the wave blade configuration. Is it a fisherman, a commercial vessel, a warship? Every ship has a propeller. This propeller is never completely even. You can hear how it thumps and rotates. It can tell you how fast the propeller is turning, how many blades the propeller has, and from this you can deduce how fast this vessel is. And, important for classification, what it is.
When we did acoustic reconnaissance, for example, we recorded it on tape. With the 206 and 206 Alpha, things were quite different. They recorded it electronically. And while we could still determine ship classes with the 206 based on the acoustic analysis, ever since 206 Alpha, we've been able to record ships assigned to a class by name. Every ship has its own fingerprint, the way people have different fingerprints.
But it wasn't so easy identifying ships in spite of the modern technology, because underwater, it's anything but quiet.
Marine life is very easy to hear with the sonar system. Dolphins can really get on your nerves after a while. They really do follow you. Apparently, they are very fascinated by ships in general and submarines in particular. And they swim around and talk to us all the time. They're around constantly with their chattering noises. Sometimes they're so loud that you can't hear any vessels at all. And if you have that for 3 days in a row, continuously nonstop, they're really persistent. Then at some point, you can't stand hearing it anymore. You can also hear squid. Sometimes you can hear whales, crab migrations on the seafloor. It's relatively rare, but it does happen.
The capabilities of the 206 Alpha submarine class were demonstrated during NATO naval maneuvers. At the time, U-24 managed to carry out a training attack on the U.S. aircraft carrier Enterprise. A photo taken through the periscope provided the proof. After the attack, U-24 surfaced alongside the aircraft carrier. The Americans were not amused.
And this boat made it through the screen, the protective screen set up by the destroyers, and continued on beneath them and came quite close to the aircraft carrier and provided a snapshot as proof, which may have led to new appointments in the U.S. Navy. This story clearly demonstrates the importance of our submarine fleet. Hard to detect and so small, but they can still get close to large targets.
U17 traveled around 400,000 nautical miles in its 37 years of service. The 328 it's traveling now are hardly significant by comparison. The 66-meter pontoon is slowly maneuvered to the harbor wall in Dordrecht and moored down. The first stage of U17's adventurous journey is a success.
I'm happy. We're all happy.
Captain Jan Frankena was busy taking videos during the 3-day crossing. Because towing a submarine is something special, even for a sailor as experienced as he is. A sensational thing at sea, too.
I noticed it a little en route because there were a few ships that came a bit closer than usual. And one, that was funny, came in from the port side. Yeah, I saw there was a submarine. Yes, I responded. No problems, no torpedoes. It's empty.
This marks the end of the journey for the tugboat captain. But for U17, now it's back to Germany, along the Rhine past Duisburg to Cologne. This calls for another specialized tug, one for inland waters.
The tug for the Rhine is our biggest and best tug. We need it for the height. The captain has to be able to see over the submarine.
6 days are planned for the river leg, with U17 then traveling the last few kilometers to the museum over land on a heavy transporter.
We're delighted that with this boat we can preserve a small piece of German history. It's the only boat of the 206 Alpha class to be preserved. It will be a great experience to be able to walk through this submarine later on.
But only after precision work with a sense of proportion. U17 has to pass under numerous Rhine bridges. Retired Captain Junior Grade Jürgen Weber still prefers to take the helm himself. He's along in a motorboat for the entire last leg, from Rotterdam to Speyer. And the closer he is, the better.
To us, it's not just a steel hull, it's our second living room. We have a very close bond with this piece of steel, and it's incredible that it's traveling alongside us.
Plans and preparations for the submarine transport took 6 years. Jürgen Weber was involved the entire time. A moving event for the veteran sailor.
This transport really was something. You only experience that once in a lifetime. And then when you get to travel from Dordrecht to Speyer in a speedboat, that was incredible. It took me 4 days at home before I was back where I belonged, going from emotionally stirred back to balanced. That totally impressed me, and yes, it was also a bit of a challenge.
The transport pushes up the Rhine towards Speyer at a speed of 12 kilometers an hour. A spectacle that many Rhinelanders do not want to miss. The stage along the Rhine measures 600 kilometers. U17 never attracted this much attention when out at sea. The depths are its ancestral home. Hidden beneath the waves, it performed its mission as a reconnaissance vessel and as a hunter. As U17 passes Cologne, the waterfront is full of onlookers. They all want to see the submarine.
An event like this in Cologne is something special.
My father was actually on a submarine, but unfortunately he can't be there today, so I'll take a look and take a few pictures for him.
After all, this is one of the boats we have to thank for 40 years of peace.
There's a stopover in Cologne, with thousands of excited spectators looking on from the riverbanks. The Dutch specialize in heavy transport on inland waterways. They're not fazed by the spectators. The cargo now is even heavier than on the first leg. In addition to the 500-ton submarine, the trucks for the overland journey are on board now too. Convoy Captain Ben Kiek is enjoying the atmosphere in the cathedral city on this unusual assignment.
That's really special, a beautiful transport. And all the people on the banks, it's not every day you see something like this.
As soon as the boat is moored, Jürgen Weber is also very close again. Fellow submarine crew members seize the moment and even get permission to board the pontoon. Among them is Victor Teuker, one of the first commanders of U17.
The boat will live on, like one of our children. That sounds strange, but the boat will live on, and will probably live longer than we will. That's just a really great feeling.
Another leg of the journey complete. Jürgen Weber and his mates celebrate this successful stage with the obligatory run-in beer.
Hey! Hallo! Hallo! Schnell auf 30 Meter gehen!
The dangers, the confinement, and the time spent together in the depths all weld submariners together, even beyond their time in service. A new submarine type has taken the place of the 206 class, 212 Alpha.
Today we have the 212 class, which has been around for several years. And these boats are equipped with a fuel cell propulsion system independent of the ambient air, so they don't have to ascend to periscope depth as often. That makes them much safer and gives them a longer deployment time at sea.
The 212 Alpha class embodies a completely new generation of submarine and is the world's most modern non-nuclear type. The fuel cell system generates energy from the hydrogen and oxygen it carries on board. This revolutionary drive technology ensures dive times of more than 2 weeks and is also particularly quiet. Preparations for the big trip, on the other hand, are almost classic. Provisions are also stowed on modern vessels the same way as in grandfather's day. Comfort foods are particularly important to submariners. Soft drinks, chocolate, and savory snacks are a must on every voyage.
Yeah, it's got to be like this with all the candy and all the drinks. It always boosts morale. We can't take anything ourselves, but I'd say that if you can help yourself to another Snickers and stuff like that, well, that's a must. Otherwise, I think we'd be at each other's throats here.
Several cases of beer are stored in the boat, too. In submarine jargon, it's also known as guard tipples.
You can have the occasional guard tipple. Theoretically, every soldier is entitled to 2 bottles of beer a day, but you rarely drink them. So there's hardly anyone who drinks a beer at sea. And it has to be approved by the commander as well.
Every free corner on board the boat is used to stow provisions. The torpedo tubes would be filled with torpedoes in the event of war, but now they're used for storage. And that includes beer. One of the soldiers pushes the crates to the end of the pipe with his feet. The place where deadly projectiles would otherwise await deployment is now used for Pilsner. Frogmen are getting ready outside. Anytime a sub leaves port, the vessels are inspected for damage, but also for concealed ordnance.
We are in charge of close underwater combat defense. Before a dive, there's a search for magnetic mines or anything else that could be attached to the submarine and would keep us from leaving port.
Divers inspect the entire outer hull of the boat, even in peacetime. They not only examine the propulsion and steering systems, but also check all the external sensors. The operational capability of all technical equipment on board the U-32 must be ensured at all times. Electronics engineer Christoph Strehle conducts final tests.
Bridge, periscopes out.
The U-32 has 2 periscopes. The larger observation periscope and the smaller, less conspicuous attack periscope.
Now I'm testing the various mechanisms in the periscope. So I switch on where the rotary drive is connected, and now I can operate the periscope with the button here and turn it. I use this button to adjust the height, so we can move up and down. And now I just change the height, and I can switch the zoom, and that's that.
This periscope has a significantly wider view than the front periscope. We call this one the observation periscope. There are various things attached, like a thermal imaging device to detect infrared rays. We can look through this periscope at night and pick up radar beams. You can take bearings. The disadvantage, of course, is that we're easier to spot with the periscope extended. That's why we prefer to use the front periscope if we just want to see what's going on, because it's much smaller.
Emergency exercises are always part of the drills on submarines.
Rudder failure, steering position has failed. Rudder system switched to emergency mode.
Rudder failure. This means that the rudder can no longer be controlled from the bridge. There is a lot of ship traffic in the area. A collision would be a disaster. Helmsman Marco Baltrock must now reach the emergency rudder in the stern as quickly as possible. The emergency helm is always manned in areas with lots of ship traffic. Marco Baltrock now takes over communication with the bridge. The rudder of the submarine is now controlled completely manually, using 4 levers.
Change of course for an evasive maneuver due to fishermen in the area ahead.
A quick evasive maneuver must prevent a collision. 1,500 tons of steel are steered past the other vessel entirely by hand.
We do these exercises regularly, relatively often. I wouldn't want to experience this in an emergency, but if it happened, it wouldn't be a problem to steer from back here.
The German Navy currently has 6 212 Alpha-class submarines in service. In the future, they will be joined by 2 units of the 212 CD class currently under development.
Modern submarines have really improved in terms of the sensors, weapons, and living conditions for the crew. Although submarine service was never exactly bad, even in the beginning.
After the stopover in Cologne, U17 continues up the Rhine toward Speyer. The convoy still has around 280 kilometers of waterway to go. In Speyer's natural harbor, everything is already being prepared for the heavy transport over land.
Then the hydraulic jacks will come down here before the welds are loosened, of course, and lift the submarine. That will make it half a meter or a meter higher overall. Then the flatbed drives in at the bottom, and the jacks lower it back down. Then the submarine will be resting on the flatbed together with these supports.
At least that's the plan, but not based on any real experience.
I'm a bit concerned, but not afraid. We have incredible respect for the things we do. We haven't calculated it once, we haven't calculated it twice, we've calculated it up 10 times. I don't think anything will go wrong.
It's just 4 kilometers from the natural harbor in Speyer to the museum. But this is probably the trickiest leg of the entire route. The harbor looks like a vast construction site. Frieder Sam and his team prepare the road transport. U17 is placed on steel trestles that have to be precisely aligned. This is because the flatbed has to be maneuvered through here later.
This is a crucial moment. If we position them incorrectly, and they're just at too much of an angle, too tight, the underpass will be practically impossible.
8 hydraulic presses lift the submarine, millimeter by millimeter. An underpass clearance of 1.40 meters with 15 centimeters of clearance to the right and left are a must to set the boat down safely on the flatbed later on. Over and over, the team precisely calibrates the supports.
Fingers out.
A feat like this in the middle of nature is a result of the dimensions of the submarine. 50 meters long, 9 meters high, and weighing 500 tons. This is the only place in the neighborhood where it can be loaded.
We considered various options, including the shipyard. That would work, but we can't get out of the shipyard site. We would have to tear down a building. We have no option at the harbor. The NATO ramp's too steep. We can't get out of there either.
Once everything is precisely aligned, the flatbed is driven under the boat. The trailer is 45 meters long with 30 axle modules of 8 wheels each. 680 horsepower now slip the monster in place beneath the boat. Former commander Jürgen Weber is very impressed.
Seeing a vehicle like this in action really knocks my socks off.
The transport specialists maneuver their vehicle under the boat. The brackets, in which U17 has been cradled since its departure, have to be poised precisely on the flatbed. Water is pumped out, lifting the pontoon. The segments of the flatbed are raised, and finally, U17 is resting securely on the trailer.
It's not a normal heavy transport. This is really something special.
The trip overland for U17 is now just 4 kilometers. Once on the country road, the heavy transport experts hitch up 2 more trucks. Together, the tractors now have nearly 2,500 horsepower. Frieda Sam is satisfied.
Asphalt temperature's perfect, weather's perfect. We'll stick to what was agreed beforehand. Now we'll roll comfortably with 4 tractor units.
Dozens of helpers accompany the transport on the short journey. Of course, the former crew members are also on hand. They don't intend to let their boat out of their sight.
You only get an opportunity like this once in a lifetime. And if you're part of this submarine community, it brings tears to my eyes. It's such a great feeling. This bond with a living room that's now in the museum, it's like coming home.
More alumni join in as the transport nears the museum. 4 generations of submariners have come to pay their respects to U17.
All in all, I was totally impressed with the transport from Kiel to Speyer. I was glad that we had other great companies involved, namely the Dutch with their shipping company, Van der Wees. I think the Dutch are undefeated worldwide when it comes to transport and special transports like this. And with the logistics company Kiel, we had a fantastic team here, bringing the boat from the natural harbour to the warehouse at the Technik Museum. In short, Werft Portal Kraan. Van der Wees is the shipping company, and Kiel Spedition. To me, they were the greatest.
Meanwhile, the transport has shrunk. 2 tractor units suffice to tow the sub through built-up areas. But things get critical shortly before the finish. The last curve is tight, very tight. The only chance, backing up on the home stretch. The U17 has already been rolling on this short distance for a good 3 hours as onlookers wait patiently at the museum. The sailors are less patient, but they're also thirsty. They don't want to wait any longer for their run-in beer.
Before we die of dehydration and collapse in front of the boat, that wouldn't help either.
At the end, Transport Manager Frieda Sam safely sets the boat down in its predetermined position. It will remain here for the time being, but the final destination has not yet been reached. U17 will be on display as a walk-in exhibit. It will then be spruced up to make it look as close to original as possible. The transport is scheduled for the following year and promises to be at least as exciting.
We'll be driving along country roads and through small towns and so on and so forth. We're going to have to dig even deeper into our bag of tricks. We have to turn the submarine on the water, on the Neckar, in the Heidelberg area. That will be another rather challenging story.
The first 1,200 kilometers of U17's final journey to the museum have been completed. This heavy transport is already historic.